Well, hello, I'm Sylvia Rynex Appleby, and I was asked to participate in the 150-year anniversary since my family was one of the originals, so we're here continually since the start. I was very fortunate that my family had retained many photos and documents, so I was able to attempt a PowerPoint presentation as a means of sharing them. This will be my first PowerPoint, so please bear with me if there's any flaws. My daughter Samantha will be assisting with the presentation and throughout the day with the exhibits. I will begin with a poem that I wrote after getting inspired by all the information I was collecting, and Meredith asked me if I would read it. Then I'll continue with the Grove history and end with my family's contributions over the years. I hope this will give the new residents a quick little history of the town, and the old timers maybe a brief reminder of growing up here. So let's begin. This is the ode that I wrote for the poem. A dedication to the historic 150 years. We pay tributes through many forms of cheers. The date of August 13th of 1873 is the anniversary that we observe with glee. This is a celebration of the first camp meeting that was initiated through the association's leadings. A lot of preparations were required for the events, including sites that were needed near the circle for 250 tents. It was scheduled to last a total of 10 days, but so much rain only left a few moments of the sun's rays. A later title of A Town Within a Forest would have been an appropriate description to entice all the original tourists. We were very fortunate to have the services of the B&O train. 3 to 4 ran daily for the benefit of our visitors, even through the rain. The Sacred Circle became an important location, especially for all those with religious vocations. The charming cottages were starting to appear, first in the circle to be appropriately near. The conveniences of the era were the outhouses and the yards with water pumps, which were contributed the local scavenger, transporting deposits to the forest dumps. Other structures became needed to accommodate the increasing masses. The tabernacle, the assembly hall, and much later the auditorium that the needs did surpass. The camp meetings then in 1937 were finally dissolved, but the town of Washington Grove became incorporated, become the new resolve. My final notations, the absence of the meetings didn't impair too much of the town's future success, or there certainly wouldn't have been a reason for such a wonderful celebration now to address. I wanted to share some of the basic Washington Grove history before I relay my family's personal contributions to the Grove. The early times seem to reflect an American Victorian era, but I discovered it was actually called a missionary generation. I thought this might help prepare people to understand what the lifestyles were at the beginning of the anniversary. Early in 1873, a committee representing Methodist churches were looking for sites in Montgomery County. They settled for 267 acres of Nathan Cook's farm in Gatesburg and paid $6,636 for it. It was chosen for its healthy elevation, the forest, and springs. In June of 1873, a meeting was set up with the Washington Grove Camp Meeting Association of the District of Columbia and Maryland, and the churches to describe the camp meeting's plans. The land was conveyed to the Camp Meetings Association on July 3rd of 1873. Most of the original people that came to Washington Grove were D.C. residents seeking a religious retreat and shelter from the summer heat of D.C. through the means of the local railroad system. Part of the promotions used were advertisements posted about the great religious and healthy benefits of the community of Washington Grove. The plans were appropriately organized through the Washington Grove Association. On July the 4th of 1873, a grand picnic was prepared in Washington Grove to introduce the D.C. residents to this country oasis. At this occasion, the Washington Grove Camp Meeting Association started the sales of stocks that they needed for the future residents. They luckily received $3,000 from the first event. This was needed to start the capital base fund for their new nonprofit organization. There were many expenditures involved with the organization of the camp meetings. August 13th of 1873 was the date of the first Washington Grove camp meeting. It was scheduled to last 10 days. Much preparation was needed, especially for this initial occasion. Wells to be dug, outhouses set up, water pumps installed, pathways cleared, and areas for the horses, and 250 tent sites. Stores were made available for the following companies: the barbers, the confectionery, the vegetable market, and furniture. And a dining hall was also an important addition. 3 to 4 trains ran daily to bring the visitors. Discounts were granted by the train company because they were having financial problems. Wagons and carriages brought the supplies. 5,000 to 8,000 visitors attended this event. In the coming years, they would have up to 10,000, depending on the historic occurrences. It was very hard to imagine that many people visiting town now. This was a very popular activity for the guests. More than DC residents started participating at these events. Montgomery County visitors wanted to attend also, so the attitude, the more the merrier, must have been felt. The Washington Grove Camp Meeting Association of District of Columbia and Maryland capital stocks were fixed at $20,000, divided by 1,000 shares, resulting in $20 each. One stock allowed the owner to vote at the stockholders' yearly meeting and select a tent site for the camp meetings. 5 shares allowed the owner to vote and a cottage site. In 1877, a tabernacle was built in the middle of the sacred circle. The long depression of the 1870s raised questions to the viability of the new venture, but since the B&O train kept running, the majority of the camp meeting stockholders were able to maintain their investments. In 1897, C.J. Maddox, a county surveyor, was paid to prepare Grove survey plans. It was a Maryland law that made it mandatory for subdivisions. One of the new additions was the arrangement of the houses having their fronts facing the avenues and the back facing the streets. Charming summer cottages started appearing around the circle. They were small wooden structures with a few rooms, gabled roofs, and gingerbread trim. Then stained glass accent windows were sometimes added. No indoor plumbing, and lucky families had a water pump near. Later, the circle started getting too overcrowded with the summer cottages, and some were being moved to other locations in the Grove. They were usually moved by loading them on some type of wooden rollers. In 1901, the Assembly Hall was built with donated funds. It was given the bell from the original tabernacle, which is still rung for special occasions. The name was changed in 1957 to McCatherine Hall because of the first mayor. In 1902, the hotel started having entertainment with recitals, music, and readings. This served as a welcome alternative to the strictly religious venues of the past. Because the Assembly Hall had very limited space for these growing activities, the auditorium was built in 1905 to seat 1,400. In 1906, a contract with Pepco was created for the electric outside lights to replace the gas, and a new train station was added around that time. In 1910, Maple Lake was created to supply ice to the summer residents. The first year, they produced 300 tons of ice. Later in 1951, it was decided that the lake would be rebuilt. It became a very popular swimming location, especially for the children. Around 1910 period, recreational activities started to become popular. Many tennis courts were being built on private homes, and 2 were in the park. The baseball diamond was built and a team was created. The croquet game was played in many yards starting around this time. In 1918, during World War I, the Girls Club requested permission to host a dance for the recuperating soldiers of Walter Reed. And when I read this, I was amazed because 50 years later, I was doing this. The Red Cross recruited my senior Girl Scout troop during the Vietnam War to go to dances with the recuperating soldiers of Walter Reed. Only a few of us continued volunteering, and more hospitals were added. It was ironic that the Girls Club was denied permission, and after a year of dances, we were nicely rewarded. But the Girls Club tried again for another dance in 1920 at their clubhouse. This was for their members only and was successful because they didn't ask permission. In 1922, Washington Grove had electric interior lights, telephones, and automobiles. In 1927, indoor plumbing and water were available, at least on Chestnut Avenue. Now, I knew this because my grandmother, Mary Maxwell, had hers added to her house at 120 Chestnut Avenue then. Now, after 100 years, the WSSC is finally repairing the water and the plumbing on Chestnut Avenue. I personally have been able to observe this part of history. From 1928 to 1938 was the Great Depression, when many summer cottages of Washington Grove were given up or just neglected because of the financial crisis, sort of like the previous long depression of the 1870s. In 1935, house numbers were being incorporated for the addresses. So in 1937, camp meetings were finally dissolved, and the town of Washington Grove was incorporated with a mayor and a town council. In 1939, the streets were finally paved with the normal hard top. In the 1940s, World War II started housing shortages in D.C. This brought a new and welcome influx of residents to Washington Grove. This contributed to a more diverse type of neighborhood. In 1955, the new Washington Grove Methodist Church was built. In 1956, the new elementary school was built to replace the one-room schoolhouse. In 1975, a master plan was needed and prepared for the town. In 1980, Washington Grove was added to the National Register of Historic Places. Now, I want to give you some brief details of the history and the importance of the camp meetings and the train system that were vital factors for the survival of the Grove over 150 years. I also was asked to share some of my family's personal contributions to the 150 years of the Grove history. They reminded me that my family is one of the few still remaining that were here continually since the start. Having built 6 houses made it easier for my 5 generations to live here. I believe currently there's about 14 different families who have members that have returned to live in the Grove, and I feel this is very significant since many of them wanted to return to their hometown. I've been very fortunate many types of documents were retained over the years by my family. A lot of these items have been put into albums for people to look at and share today. One thing I really noticed in gathering the information was how much my family had in common among themselves over the years, as many others probably did with their own ancestors. I made a point of acknowledging it when I observed it occurring. The sequence of information will be relayed logically from the first of the ancestors that established a connection and continued through the years to the present time. My great-grandparents, Samuel F. Rynex and his wife, Addie, purchased stock certificates for their property during the first occasion in 1873 through the Washington Grove Association. He was from a well-known Washington family, a Union Civil War vet, a church presiding elder, and owned a department store in D.C. When Addie determined she needed a job, she went directly to the current president and requested one. His identity I have not determined, but she was granted her first government job. They were very happy to join this religious and healthy environment of Washington Grove. Then in 1890, they had number 8 on the Circle, a house built as a summer cottage, and resided to 1912. From 1912 to 1920, their adult daughters, Bird Rynex and Lucy Rynex Murphy, inherited and co-owned that cottage. That Auntie Bird never married and worked for the government at GPO. Auntie Lucy and her husband also bought the cottage at number 6 next door on the Circle from 1913 to 1920 and used it as a guest cottage for company. Auntie Lucy hosted the Capitol Hill crowds because her husband's high position with interstate commerce. Plus, he even had his daughter sit in on the congressional talks. When he retired, he had the position of the deputy director of the agency, plus he retired with 52 years of service because he started out as a congressional aide. Auntie Lucy, at age 46, was a survivor of the Knickerbocker Theater blizzard tragedy in 1922 in the Adams Morgan neighborhood. This was near where her D.C. home was in Lanier Heights. She attended this with a student boarder they had taken in. Her husband went to a poker game across town that evening. The Grand Theater normally seated 1,700, but only 300 showed up the night, including the orchestra. It was recorded that 98 were killed, 133 were injured, and 69 others. All I heard about Auntie Lucy after the tragedy was she's greatly traumatized by it, but she lived. Her husband tried desperately to get to her. Unfortunately, trolley cars were the main mode of transportation, and they weren't very efficient in 28 inches of snow. Auntie Lucy died in 1946 at age 70 due to being given codeine as medicine. I was also told that Auntie Bird died previously in 1941 at age 63 from the same cause. Unfortunately, it wasn't discovered until later that the fatal error was they were allergic to it. It probably was questioned later because most of these Rynexes lived to their 90s. Lucy had one daughter, Marguerite Murphy, which was born in 1900 and spent most summers in Washington Grove visiting her cousins, Alan, my father, and Lucille, his sister. Her parents used Samuel, the grandfather's cottage first, then they bought their own. She fortunately took many pictures of that period, which some remain with me now. Marguerite never married. She went to Tulane University. She taught school and later worked for the government at HEW. Since my father had very few relatives during this generation, his cousin Marguerite was his dearest. Her mother was a Rynex, but her father came to D.C. from a prominent family in Louisiana, so she spent many of her youth between the South and D.C. She even had to go through the official introduction into Southern society ritual. She wasn't thrilled with the formality. After her parents died, she sold their D.C. home and had a nice house built in Edinor. She was good at telling stories of her past, especially the Washington Grove during her youth in the 1900s. I remember stories about Samuel, her grandfather, and how strict he was about religion. On Sundays, you couldn't do anything that wasn't church-related, no working for adults, and no playing for children. She died in 1990 at age 90. After Samuel's son, Frank Reddick Rynex, my grandfather got married to Gertrude Robinson in 1893. They had a summer cottage built on 4th Avenue. Then in 1903, they had one of the first permanent houses built at 202 Chestnut Avenue. Gertrude was a landscape artist that attended Corcoran Art School after moving to D.C. Grandfather had a couple of positions with the Washington Grove Association while living there. Because of his position with the association, he was awarded the first telephone in the town. Along this time, grandfather belonged to some sort of group that would travel to various eastern states for drill team competitions. The only group that I could find for that period was called the Foresters. They campaigned for the preservation of forest. I found an online photo of a 1925 D.C. parade sponsored by them that drew thousands of viewers. The parade was called the Rainbow Parade because of its colorful uniforms. I believe presently D.C. has a very similar parade, but a slightly different cause. Then, when he participated in these events, he wrote these romantic letters to his wife about the competitions, and she faithfully responded back. My grandfather also was working for the government at GPO during this period, then switched to the Bureau of Naturalizations as a publications editor. My grandmother was a secretary in the first women's club from 1910 to 1913. The original club was set up much like the 1926 accredited version. It had a constitution and followed the Robert Rules of Order. They had close to 30 members, which were probably those with permanent houses in the Grove, though many of the original families in the Grove had two homes, a summer home in the Grove and a permanent home in D.C. They met weekly, October through May, at members' homes, and dues were 25 cents a year. The biggest changes to the later club were the removal of the requirements of the religious policies and the dues. Gertrude's two youngest children, Alan, my father, in 1904, and Lucille, his sister, in 1906, were born while living at 202 Chestnut Avenue. They attended the Oakmont one-room schoolhouse through 6th grade, and surprisingly, the school had a very advanced teaching system. They had to move back to D.C. in 1916 because the neighbor's children contracted polio. Mentioning childhood diseases, in the 1960s, we were given the vaccine on a sugar cube for polio, plus a smallpox shot that left a scar on our arms. The baby boomers typically caught measles, mumps, and chickenpox as part of our normal childhoods. Now, referring back 50 years, they continued to own the property in 1919, until 1919, when my grandfather sold it for $3,700. 27 was in cash and 1,000 in Liberty bonds was received for the payment. I had never heard of this type of transaction. Mary Robinson, my great-grandmother, and her husband, George Robinson, and daughter Gertrude came to D.C. from Edwardsport, Indiana, because he was recruited as an engineer at the White House under President Benjamin Harrison from 1889 to 1893. Harrison had been a political representative for Indiana prior to his presidency. He wanted to do improvements to the White House during his administration. Wabash, Indiana was the first city anywhere to entirely have electricity, justifying the reason for recruiting an Indiana engineer. So George Robinson was hired to oversee the installation of the electricity in the White House and the 3 neighboring government buildings. At this time, the electricity was primarily for the lighting of the buildings. After the installation, the president and his wife were scared to death of it. They wouldn't touch the switches, and the lights would stay on all night until the electrician came in the morning to turn them off. George, my great-grandfather, unfortunately died shortly after this government job at the White House. Mary, my great-grandmother, then took a government job at GPO and later moved to Washington Grove in 1911 to be near her only daughter, Gertrude. Mary remarried, and her new husband was John Maxwell. John Maxwell was a commissary manager during World War I. Mary had the house built at 120 Chestnut Avenue. She had Major Walker build the house at a cost of $1,500. In 1927, she had the indoor plumbing and the water added at a cost of $425. The WSSC equivalent cost $79 for the external hookup. On the 4th of July of 1918, my 14-year-old father was visiting his grandmother Maxwell in the Grove. He and a friend walked up to Gaithersburg to purchase fireworks. On the way home, he noticed a ripe cherry tree and decided to climb it to pick cherries. Unfortunately, he didn't notice that the electric line was running through the top of it. His head got a severe wound and it burned through to the skull. He was taken to the D.C. hospital and remained under their care after they stretched the skin over the burned area. He was very lucky. He lived without any serious after effects that could have been a possible fatal accident. Of course, as typical in the family, many photos were taken of him in the hospital. Then it was joked about later for this reason for him becoming an electrician. Mary's daughter Gertrude, grandson Alan, and granddaughter Lucille moved to Hollywood later in 1918 because Lucille was having health issues. It was a rational decision since Gertrude had lost her first 2 children to illnesses. Alan, my father, and Lucille then graduated from Hollywood High School in the 1920s. Notably attended school with Lon Chaney Jr. My father owned a radio shop and worked on Hollywood movie sets, mainly regarding lighting and general electricity. I believe Universal Studios is where he spent most of his time. One of the more famous movies he worked on was The Phantom of the Opera. He also did electrical work at Pickfair, the renowned estate of Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks. Plus, he had a memorable occasion with Bing Crosby that I'll save for later. My father remained in Hollywood until 1940. After returning to Maryland, he worked for the government as an electrician, which he was previously noted to be destined for. He was working at the David Taylor Model Base, and when he finally retired, his sister Lucille took singing lessons after graduation and sang at least once at the Hollywood Bowl. She later caught tuberculosis and had to stay in a sanitarium to recover, which was the normal procedure then. There she met her future husband, Paul Sieberman, and remained in California most of the remaining of her 93-year life. Gertrude, my grandmother, continued to live in California while her husband, Frank, remained in D.C. working to support the family. They ultimately divorced after the children were adults. In 1926, the divorce was issued when Gertrude chose to stay single in California. Frank, my grandfather, got remarried to Maud Rogers in 1930. She worked for the D.C. courts as a wedding official. A humorous article was written in the D.C. papers about her, basically regarding the fact that it took so long for a wedding official to actually get married. One of the famous authorizations was for the Loving family in the June of 1958. This was a Supreme Court case that overturned a Virginia law that would allow interracial married couples to live in Virginia. My daughter Samantha was watching the movie on TV that was made about it, and it actually showed the wedding license and Maud's name on it as the wedding official. Samantha wasn't familiar with her name, but thought it might be relative, so she called me and asked me about Maud, and I happily informed her that she was my step-grandmother. Then, when she retired, the D.C. papers wrote another article about her. They wanted her to share her opinions of her life in the position of a one-woman wonder. She had to have 4 employees to replace her. I personally experienced the same thing when I retired from the government. She ended the interview by adding that she and my grandfather were planning on traveling for a 2-month tour of Europe, and I do remember they did a lot of traveling. 1940, when Mary Robinson Maxwell, my great-grandmother, died at age 84, her daughter Gertrude inherited the house at 120 Chestnut Avenue. Gertrude, my grandmother, and her son Alan, my soon-to-be father, came from California to settle the estate in Washington Grove. Gertrude sold the property, and she and my father bought the property at 112 Chestnut Avenue. The previous owners of that property date back at least the 1880s, around the time the original house was built. One of the more famous occupants was Chief Justice John Marshall Harland and his family for 2 years, from 1882 to 1884. This was during the early part of his appointment at D.C. They wanted to get away from a while from the D.C. city life to a more healthy location in the country. He also took a second job to supplement his income. Apparently the judges' salaries weren't substantial enough for the new expected D.C. lifestyles. He taught law at what is now GW University and had to commute by train 6 days a week. When they returned to D.C., they were able to go to a nice new house. They remained there until his death in 1911. The Women's Club sent a condolence note to his wife after his death. In 1970, Edna Reber, a well-known writer, and her husband George lived there for a couple of years. Then she moved to her final Grove location of 419 Mockingbird Hill. In the later years, my father started having discussions with her, reminiscing about the good old days in the Grove, and I have a letter from her relating to one of their visits. Mr. Robert Milan, who was a lawyer, and his family had the home starting in the 1920s until my father and his mother purchased it in 1940. Gertrude, her son, my father, had the original house that was on the property torn down because it didn't remain in good conditions after many years of neglect, especially after the Depression years when many houses were deserted in the Grove because of the financial crisis. This was very unfortunate since the original property was rather stately. It had a tennis court, 2 lily ponds, a fish pond, a pergola, and the perimeter of the interior yard had a bordered garden beds, cemented garden beds. So when they decided to have a new house built, they had 1 fish pond and parts of broken cement borders remaining. Since this was during the time of World War II, my father had to serve in the military, which meant he enlisted in the Coast Guard. In 1942 and 1943, he was away, and his mother, fortunately, was able to stay with the Smiddles. The family had purchased her mother's property. When my father came back, he continued with the completion process of the house at 112 Chestnut Avenue, and then he started working in D.C. While commuting, he carpooled with some of the Grove husbands. Because of the shortages and the rationing during World War II, carpooling was a typical occurrence. Bessie Coleman, my future mother, was living with her parents in Washington Grove temporarily at the time. because Bessie was working as a bookkeeper in D.C. and using mass transportation to work. Some of my father's carpool buddies kept trying to get him to meet Bessie since they were both single at the time. Bessie reneged for a while, then finally gave in. They got married in May of 1945, and my mother and father lived with his mother at 112 Chestnut Avenue until Gertrude died in 1958 at age 83. During the baby boomers generation, my parents had 3 precious daughters. Maylu was born in 1946, and she received a degree in nursing and art at MC. She married twice, had a total of 6 children. In the earlier years, she would return home a couple of times. Some of her children were baptized in the Grove. Currently, she likes to bake for the church's annual fundraiser. Phyllis was born in 1947, and she attended Corcoran Art School like her grandmother, plus the Art Institute of Vienna while she was working at the embassy. She also changed her first name to Maggie around this time. Then, after ending her work at the USIA and the State Department, she finally retired. On October 3rd of 1993, she married Carlos Gutierrez in Washington Grove, and the reception was at McCatherine Hall. They moved to and are currently residing in Montgomery, Texas. She stays busy with her memberships with the local art leagues. I, the old soul, and the youngest, was born in 1953. My parents were significantly older than most parents of children my age. My father was actually 50 when I was born, but the ages were never a problem for us children. We mainly attended Washington Grove Elementary School. We walked to and from school daily, and on a special occasion, I remember being given a nickel to stop at Hershey's to buy penny candy. Of course, setting 1 penny for the bubblegum machine to try to win that striped ball. That would reward you with 5 more cents of candy. Many of my generation can attest to this part. During my childhood, I spent many summers playing croquet in the yard with my sisters. We went swimming at the lake and even took lessons there, plus going over to the park and learning to play tennis, mainly with my neighbor Janet. This was very beneficial and later in high school when Meredith Horan, Ann Winter, Kathy Lehman, and I, all from the Grove, were members of our high school tennis team. But I want to note, we weren't on at the same times, but we all still played. We may have inherited some of this talent from our families. I know my father played tennis in the earlier years. I even got him to practice with me on the Grove courts when I was on the team, and he was in his late 60s. During my early teenage years in the 1960s in the Grove, I did a lot of babysitting. This was how young people learned the value of a buck, since we only got 50 cents an hour. This is how we called this our spending money, since many didn't even get allowances. In 1970, my local senior Girl Scout troop was requested by the Red Cross for volunteers to retain the returning Vietnam soldiers at various hospitals, but mainly at Walter Reed. First, it was a group of girls just singing in the wards. Then they asked individuals to attend their dances. I and my Girl Scout neighbor Janet and another friend helped continually for over a year. Then on August 12th, 1971, we received rewards from President Nixon and a lunch on the Sequoia presidential yacht as a form of reward. At this time, I had started working for the Visual Arts Department at the National Bureau of Standards, first in the photo lab and the graphics section, and our agency had a group to manage some social events for the employees for extra incentives called SEBA. This was besides your normal job. For some reason, I got recruited to help with these committees right from the start. I eventually became in charge of some of the annual social events to include the picnics and the holidays for hundreds of employees. I believe this helped me prepare for the Women's Club for later years. Because of my originating association with the photo lab, I'd be asked on special occasions to help them by posing for some of the federal publication assignments. But after the tragedy in 9/11, I was transferred to a newly established Emergency Services Division. By this time, the agency had changed its name to the National Institute of Standards and Technology. This new division was initiated immediately as their equivalents in other government agencies. Its main purpose was to set up plans and procedures in case of terrorist attacks. On July 3rd of 2014, I finally retired with a total of 43 years of government service. I lived at 112 Chestnut Avenue from my birth in 1953 until my marriage in 1976. When we first married, we only lived a few miles away in Gaithersburg. We continued to assist my parents whenever it was needed. Then I and my husband, Tom Appleby, inherited the property from my parents in 1986. My mother, Bessie, was active in the community as a vacation Bible school teacher, and for many years, a Brownie Girl Scout leader. She saw to it that we were members of the Methodist Church and attended most Sundays. Some of us even sang in the choir. She lived in the Grove until her death in 1986. My sister Maylu wrote a tribute to her that was published in the Gazette. Alan, my father, became an avid gardener while living there. He belonged to the National Capital Dahlia Society. In 1966, he hybridized a dahlia called Yellow Lass, in which I was told was named for me, guessing the reason I was the only blonde child in the family, and I inherited that trait from my grandmother. As my son Gregory's likeness had been compared to his grandfather, Alan, and my father then started the new hobby of photography after being inspired by finding one of his grandmother Maxwell's old cameras. I believe she was responsible for many of these treasured historic photos. He barely then left the house without one of his trusty new cameras. When Phil Edwards was writing his information on the book on Water Grove, he contacted my father for personal knowledge of the Grove history, and a chapter was dedicated to the family. Charles Horan interviewed my father in 1991 about the knowledge of the house histories, which was for the Washington Grove Archives. He was also asked to contribute very important details of the ancestral collections of the Rynex family. This occurred when another family member, Allison Childs, was doing research on two books he was writing. The Dutch Rynex's ancestors date back to coming to America before and fought in the Revolutionary War. My father continued to live at 112 Chestnut Avenue until his death in 1996 at age 92. Maylu, my sister, and I both wrote tributes of him. Tom Appleby and I got married in July of 1976. We maintained the property continually since our inheritance of 1986. In 2009, we oversaw the tearing down of my parents' property at 112 Chestnut Avenue. This became quite a family effort from the start. I, my husband, and our children all helped with some of the demolition. My sister Phyllis and her husband even volunteered. We were very curious about what we were going to find under all the layers, but there was only a few boards from the original house of the 1880s. The major demolition had to be done then by our contractor. Tom enthusiastically continued the gardening traditions in the yard. This was very fortunate since the yard had many historic trees and plants that needed to be preserved. He enjoys annually in the spring planting flowers on Brown Street under the Grove sign. Not to forget his later assistance to the Women's Club, which he was made an honorary member. On October of 2009, we moved in. By January, we were asked to host the annual auction. Immediately then, this started a 10-year more current community involvement. On our family's fifth generation to contribute are our children, Gregory and Samantha Appleby of the Millennials era. When they were first born, they were baptized in the Grove Church. Then they came to live here, and the current house was completed in 2009. Samantha worked for the Grove as a part-time grounds maintenance person. My grandfather managed some of the Grove maintenance departments over 100 years ago as part of his responsibilities with the association. Samantha is currently teaching at GW University, like Chief Justice Harlan did when he was living at the residence. Gregory, partner Rochelle, and Samantha have helped many times with the more current contributions to the Grove. Now that I'm a little less able, I've been very fortunate that they would be assist for special occasions. They've performed many sort of behind-the-scenes type assistance that weren't obvious. Prime example, the last couple of years, getting our acre yard ready for the garden strolls. And of course, presently with the 150-year anniversary. I only hope if some attending from the good old days, such as Marilyn, Joan, Kenny, Nancy, Joe, Ann, Phil, Cynthia, and Meredith, just to mention a few, that will be happy to be reminded at least a few things of their past lives in the Grove. Plus, as I mentioned earlier, I have prepared albums with some historic documents, starting at the beginning and continuing over the years. All are welcome to view the documents that I brought today. And thank you for your historic patience of my long 150 years reflections.